Welcome everyone to Knox County Science Summer Activity number 3 for 8th grade science, part of KCS at Home. I'm Brandon Clowers, 8th grade science teacher at Carnes Middle School, and today we're going to talk about genetic variation in local population changes due to a rapidly changing environment. First, the activity that goes along with this lesson can be found under Student Resources tabs on the Knox County Schools website, www.knoxschools.org. Also, show us what you learned and tweet at KCS Science at KCS Science. Tell us all about anything that you've learned and anything that you can put with today's lesson. If this video is hard to understand, you have a couple of options. First, turn on the closed captions if available. Adjust the playback speed to slow down the video. Consider watching short clips, pause, listen, and then watch again. Ask someone in your home to watch the video with you. Stop frequently and talk to your partner about what you heard and what you might have understood. So first off, we have a question. How well do you handle changes? Now, changes come in a wide variety of shapes and forms. One change can be a traffic jam. If you really want to go somewhere fast, and if you've ever sat in traffic, you know that changing outside of your ability to handle it sometimes can be frustrating. Another change can be the change of seasons. I like fall, but everybody has their own favorite season, and you have to change accordingly. Your clothing, maybe what you do, your outside activities, things like that. Change in the weather. Sometimes if you're planning on a bright sunny day and a rain cloud comes ahead, then that could change your whole plans. Or probably the thing that we're dealing with the most right now, COVID-19. It has definitely changed everything about how we do school, community, relationships with fellow people. So we've had to adapt very, very quickly to sudden change. So our standard we're going to cover today is develop a scientific explanation of how natural selection plays a role in determining the survival of a species in a changing environment. So the key thing is the environment has to be changing. So our essential question: how do sudden changes in the environment impact a species' survival? Well, we've had to change a lot about our life here in the last few weeks. But can you imagine a bigger change, or something that really required us to have to learn to survive and not just fight off boredom? So let's talk about that. Here's your success criteria. You will know that you understood today's lesson when you can predict what might happen to an organism after an extreme environmental change based on that organism's traits. So traits are anything that can be structural, like claws, height, camouflage, or behavioral, maybe nocturnal, hunting at night, hunting in packs, things like that. So let's refresh our memory on natural selection. Natural selection definition is the process by which individuals are better adapted to their environment, are more likely to survive and reproduce more than other members of the same species. Now, a species is one type of organism that is able to reproduce, have babies, have offspring, and to be able to survive. So humans would be a species, dogs would be a species, things like that. The 4 parts to natural selection is overproduction. So unfortunately, think about like a spider. A spider lays hundreds of eggs. Well, not all of those eggs are going to hatch and turn into baby spiders. So the overproduction helps them to be able to survive so those babies can grow up and have babies of their own. Genetic variation, that's a change and kind of like differences within a same species that some make it better to adapt than others. Competition, survival of the fittest. If you're able to get food If you're able to fight off predators, then you will be able to survive. And finally, selection. The selection of being able to choose a mate, to be able to maybe choose your food, choose your habitat, will definitely help you survive. Today we're going to talk about number 2, genetic variation. Here's the definition. Any difference between individuals of the same species. Now I'm 6'4". Some people say that's pretty tall. There are taller people than me, there are shorter people than me, but that's a variation with us as humans. Another variation would be coloring. So look at these giraffes. All of these giraffes have different patterns. Some are light, some are dark, some are 2 colors, some may be more colors. And the beaks on these birds. Now the beaks are a variation. All of these are birds. Now they may be different types of birds, but the different beaks help them eat different prey. Some are more adapted for bugs, some are more adapted for cracking open nuts, and some are long and slender that can maybe get into a flower to get pollen, nectar, something like that. Here's some more examples of generic variation. Apples. All the different apples that you see at the store. They're all technically the fruit apple, but the variation makes them the different types, maybe different flavors, different colors, different sizes. These butterflies have genetic variation as far as their coloring. So their coloring makes them stand out and makes them unique, even though they may be the same species. Skin tone. All humans are humans, but we have different skin tone. Some are light complected, some are dark complected. Eye color is just like skin tone. You could have brown eyes, blue eyes, green eyes. Doesn't mean that you're not the same human. You're human, but we have different coloring. And talking about height again. Short humans, tall humans, we're still humans. We just have variation in the trait of height. Now, how do we get these variations? Genetic variations are determined from genes that are passed down from our parents. Depending on the father and the mother's genes, it is up to math what traits we get. So, we can figure this out using a Punnett square. Now, if you haven't done a Punnett square before, all it is, basically, they can be a little bit more complicated, but basically there's a 4-box, 2x2 structure. You put, say, for eye color, you put your father's eye color, so say blue on top, and your mother's eye color on the side, say brown. Why is brown over blue? Well, wait a minute. Father has blue and little b. Mother has brown, but she also has a little b. Well, that's the 2 different types of traits. One is called a dominant trait, and one is called a recessive. The dominant will always mask the recessive trait. Then you simply cross these. You bring 1 letter over, 1 letter down, 1 letter over, 1 letter down. And depending on the cross, it's all up to math. Now this is the simplest of the simple, and you may have done this before, but if not, let's look at an example. So when using a Punnett square, you put the mother's genes on one side, the father's on the other side, and you simply cross them to combine. Each square now represents the probability or chance of the offspring getting a trait, kind of like rolling dice. So for this example right here, let's look at the left side of the example first. So we have a blue and blue, so recessive and recessive because it's lowercase. We have a dominant B for brown and a dominant B for brown. So when we cross these, notice each of these boxes gets a dominant capital letter and a lowercase little blue. Well, since blue is recessive, he's going to lose. All right? So the brown covers the blue, and all 4 squares have a dominant capital B in it. That means that all the children that they have, there is a 100% chance of brown eyes and a 0% chance of blue eyes. Now, it's a little bit different if you have a parent who is either all recessive, total recessive, or what's called heterogeneous. So we have a dominant B and a recessive B. So when you cross these, notice the top layer gets the dominant B in both, But the bottom layer gets the recessive B from the top, the recessive B from the side. Now that's important because now only 2 squares have the dominant B. So that means if mother and father had an offspring or a baby, they would have a 50% chance of having brown eyes and a 50% chance of having blue. Now, they could have 4 children. That does not mean that they are going to have 2 with brown and 2 with blue. It resets every time. But it's still math. Math determines what genes get passed. So let's practice with a blank one. So if we try this Punnett square here, we have the father's genes on top and the mother's on the side. So the father is going to have the dominant trait. Now this could be eye color, hair color, height, anything. But it's going to be dominant because he has one capital B. Now he also carries the recessive gene, but remember the recessive gene gets covered up by the B, the big B. Mother is totally recessive, 100% recessive, little b, little b. So when we cross these, we bring the top B down, the little b over. Top B down, little b over. Top down, mother's over. Father's down, mother's over. Now what does that tell us? Just like last slide, when we cross these genes, we find that 2 out of 4, or 50% of the boxes, have the dominant capital B. 2 out of 4, or 50%, have both lowercase b, so the recessive genes. That gives us the outcome that every time a child is born, there is a 50-50 chance of having a dominant or a recessive gene. So kind of like flipping a coin, you've got 50-50 chance of getting heads or tails. So if you had this combination, then you would have a 50-50 chance. Now why is this important? Well, eye color is not going to make us survive as a human race. Okay? But other traits are also controlled by these crossing of the genes. Now they could be traits, think about animals. It could be a trait for speed. It could be a trait for claws or maybe height. That's important because if you need to be faster than a predator, if you need to be able to reach way up and get food or maybe camouflage, you need to blend in. That could be beneficial in surviving as an organism and surviving as a total species. Now, let's remember about some environmental changes that we talked about this year in 8th grade science. We already learned this year about environmental changes. Now, those changes can happen a couple of different ways. The first one is the theory of gradualism. That means that it occurs very slowly over millions of years. So that means that a mountain could be made very slow and then wore down very slow. Or maybe the continental drift, plate tectonics, is very, very slow, about 5 centimeters per year, or 2 inches. So that's one theory, but the other theory that we talked about was catastrophism. It occurs due to quick, sudden changes in the environment. Some may call this sudden change punctuated equilibrium. Not sure how your teacher taught it, but we call it catastrophism. Root word of that is catastrophe, something that occurs very, very quickly. Now, here are some examples of environmental changes that occur very quick. A volcanic activity, okay? Now, volcanoes can be around for thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of years, but they don't erupt all the time. When they do erupt, it causes a quick environmental shift in the local area, all the area around the volcano. Another local change could be an earthquake. Now, some earthquakes are small, some are very, very large. Some could separate different organisms of the same species on one side or the other, or maybe it changes the way a river flows, or maybe it changes the type of sediment that's in the river. That could cause a change in the habitat, which would cause the organisms to have to change. Another example would be a flood. If an area floods very, very rapidly, it could definitely change the local environment and the population of organisms very, very quickly. So now it's your turn. This activity has 2 tasks. Now the first is to teach you how to score probability and of dominant and recessive genes by getting passed down And the second task has you create an alien offspring that will have to try and adapt and be able to survive in its new environment. So the first activity, let's look at part one first. Okay? Now, first, practice with finding traits getting passed down. So you're going to practice with a dominant and a recessive trait. Okay? In order to do this, you need a couple of coins. Now, they could be quarters, pennies, whatever. Okay? Gold doubloons work too, if you have those. So you take the 2 coins, and that represents your mother and your father. So when you toss those, you're either going to get heads, and we're going to call that dominant trait. Remember, that's a capital letter. The dominant trait is the one that's going to win. It gets covered up, or it does the covering up, excuse me, of the recessive trait. So if you say tails is going to be the recessive trait. So if you flip your quarter, or coins, excuse me, and both of them are heads, then that means you have a double dominant trait. If you flip your coins and you get both tails, it would be a double recessive trait. One or the other, it would be one dominant and one recessive. But remember, the dominant and the recessive, that recessive still gets covered up. So the second part of the task, you will actually get to calculate mathematically. I know you're so excited to do math. Calculate mathematically the probability of these traits showing up. Now remember, that's important because if everybody had these dominant traits, what would happen eventually to the recessive traits? Well, eventually they would go away. And that's really what happens. So let's say, for example, you have a bunch of giraffe. You have tall giraffe and short giraffe. So all of a sudden, something changes. The food, all right, the trees that the giraffe have to eat, there's no food low, okay? Everything's really high. Well, that's a problem. What's going to happen to the short-necked giraffes? They're not going to get enough food. Unfortunately, they're going to perish or die. And that leaves only who to reproduce and have babies? The tall ones. So eventually, over many, many generations, thousands of years, even millions of years, all of the short giraffes would eventually die out, only passing down now the gene for tall necks. Okay? So the second part, you'll calculate mathematically the possibility of all of that happening. Now there's no right or wrong answer to this activity, actually at all, parts 1 or part 2, because it's all up to chance. You're flipping coins, kind of like rolling dice. You don't know what's going to happen. But remember, the second part of this, you have to toss your coins 60 times. Now, why 60? That's a lot. Yes, it is. But the more times you do something, the better data you get. Remember how we do science. Okay? Speaking of part 2, calculating probability, this is what it's going to look like. Now, you have a potential outcome. Okay? Right there. So remember, 1 coin represents your mother. 1 coin represents your father. It doesn't matter which side you put it on. But when you toss them, they have a cross. So you can do that. Now here's where you're going to calculate your tosses. Okay, so every time you toss your 2 coins, you're going to write down a big T, big T, big T, little t, or little t, depending on what you get. After you do that, you calculate up how many, and you can even color these boxes in to help you see better. That'd be great too. But you're going to count up the number of big T, that's total dominant. You're going to calculate the number of total recessive, and what we call a hybrid. That means 1 dominant, 1 recessive. And when you do the number here, then you just divide it by 60, times that by 100. It explains it in the instructions, and that'll give you your percentage. Now, that's important because part 2, or task 2, has a little bit more application to it. Okay, so remember, determine the probability and percentage that certain traits will live on. Hopefully those traits were useful to that organism. Okay, kind of like tall necks if the food's way up high, or you really don't want to be the slowest if there are predators around. Not going to end up good. So task 2. Okay, task 2, you are on the planet Xenon. And an earthquake deep inside caused all the volcanoes to erupt at once. Now that's going to change the environment. And it even tells you in the instructions here what the new environment looks like. So this time you only need one coin and then colored pencils or crayons to color your alien when you're done. So you flip, and instead of just finding out the probability, we're actually seeing what traits are going to come out. That could be the number of eyes, the skin color, fur color, if it even has fur, height, limb. So some have short arms, some could have long legs. That might be important for the new environment. Okay? Task 2. Take what you learned about genetic variations and see if you can create an organism that is able to survive in a quickly changing environment. So when you get done with your alien, you're going to sit there and think and look at the new description of the environment and say, if this alien was really living in this environment, would it be able to survive? Now, why is survival important? Because only the ones that survive are able to have babies. So if you don't have babies, you don't have a species. Okay? So this one right here kind of talks about the probability, but you don't know if you're going to be able to survive until you go through the task. Now, when you're finished with this activity, see if you can apply what you've learned to your own life about genetic variation. So think about your traits that you might have. Everybody's different and everybody has strengths and everybody has weaknesses. So think about a trait or a talent that you might have that's very useful. Okay, if you're very fast, I'm not very fast at all, then quickness could be a good talent or a good trait. If you're tall, maybe you consider that a good trait. Maybe if your hair color, you think that might help out in certain situations. Just think about the talents and traits you have that are useful. Now think about some other traits that you might have that you would have to maybe adapt in order to change if your environment changes. Okay, I'm good with sun. Sun doesn't really bother me, but I have a friend that really gets burnt really easily. So if some reason we were changed and we were stranded on a desert island, he better find a way to be able to cover up the sun's harmful rays, or he's gonna have a rough time. Okay, so that would be a way to adapt. So think about changing environments. Okay, now some of you may have went to different schools. Again, we're in the middle of our COVID-19 mess that we are in right now. So we've had to really change and adapt the way we do things. I'm sitting here right now talking to you on a computer instead of talking to a classroom full of students. So it's just one way that we've had to adapt in order to get this change from this quickly changing environment. Thank you all for participating in this lesson. Stay safe, and guys, have a great day. Thank you.